Sylvester Stallone makes a surprising departure from Hollywood and ends up at a remote ranch, discovering an unexpected calling. Soon, four brazen intruders smash through his gates, burn his property, and kill his loyal dog. Enraged and devastated, Stallone decides on vengeance, taking justice into his own hands. As his world collapses before him, Stallone unexpectedly recalls forgotten lessons of endurance and resolve. Every foe he encounters seems tougher than the last, yet an unbreakable spirit awakens within Stallone. The shadows of the past begin to recede as he realizes that, at times, fighting for justice matters more than personal peace. As the dust settles and the guns fall silent, it becomes clear that true redemption is worth more than any cinematic legend could convey. Stick around if you want to discover the full story. There are plenty of surprising twists to come. Don't forget to hit the like button, leave your comments, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss a single moment. He had once strode across countless red carpets beneath the glare of camera flashes, his name synonymous with blockbusters and the kind of underdog resilience that stirred the masses. Sylvester Stallone, a cinematic icon, a man who had overcome countless obstacles both on screen and in real life, now sought a reprieve from the frenzy he had inhabited for decades. Under the public's watchful eye, he had built a career on grit and determination, pouring his soul into stories of redemption and triumph. Yet, behind the applause and the accolades, he had grown weary, of the relentless schedule, of the endless media demands, of the very image that had brought him fame and adoration. Outsiders might have found it difficult to comprehend. He had achieved what many only dream of: multiple iconic film roles, tremendous wealth, a fan base spanning continents. But the glitz and glamour held a darker side that eroded his peace of mind. Friends became increasingly difficult to distinguish from opportunists, and private moments were practically non-existent as paparazzi lenses lurked behind every shadow. Over time, the emptiness gnawed at him, a hunger not for fame or wealth, but for something simpler, a sense of belonging that transcended velvet ropes and marquee lights. That sense of hollowness led him to a decision that would shock those who still pictured him as the eternal Hollywood presence. He sold his Los Angeles home, more like a fortress of high walls and security gates, and quietly signed papers to purchase a sprawling ranch deep in the countryside, far removed from the frenetic pulse of city life. Photographs of the property had stirred him: rolling fields tinted by soft dawn light, a winding creek that cut through the land like a ribbon of silver, a modest farmhouse that radiated comfort rather than ostentation. It was a place that promised wide-open skies and introspection, a stark contrast to the neon-lit sprawl he was leaving behind. No grand announcement preceded his departure. He made no final talk show appearances to say farewell, released no dramatic press statement about stepping back to find himself. Instead, he packed his belongings, many of them practical items he had grown to appreciate: well-worn boots, comfortable jeans, and an assortment of tools that might come in handy on a ranch. The day he left Los Angeles, he simply drove away in a nondescript pickup truck, refusing offers from friends or media to document his exit. Cameras might have tried to follow, but he chose a back route and disappeared into the endless highways that threaded through desert and farmland alike, determined to find anonymity in the heartland. The journey itself was a curious mixture of hope and residual sorrow. He felt the gravity of a life spent in the public eye slowly easing. Towns came and went, each one with its own unique flavor of diners, motels, and kindly strangers who offered directions without showing any recognition of his star persona. It comforted him to realize that beyond the bright bubble of Hollywood, there existed entire communities for whom celebrity culture was distant and unimportant. He could breathe again. It was dusk when he first arrived at the small town near his ranch. The main street boasted only a handful of establishments: a grocery store, a diner, a mechanic's shop, and a cozy local bar. Street lamps cast long shadows on the pavement, illuminating passers-by who greeted one another with nods or brief words. This was precisely the environment he had sought: unhurried, unpretentious, a place where one might forge genuine connections free of pretense. Few people noticed him at first. He wore an old baseball cap low over his brow, a plain flannel shirt, and a pair of boots caked with dust from the long drive. With the practiced calm of a man adept at blending in when he chose, he pulled up beside a general store, stepped out, and inhaled the country air. He introduced himself simply as Sylvester to the shop's elderly proprietor when he stocked up on groceries and essential supplies for his new home. Although the proprietor's eyes narrowed, as if recognizing something in the lines of Sylvester's face, he did not press. Perhaps the old man had once been dazzled by a film marquee or glimpsed a magazine cover, but he chose to remain polite, responding to Sylvester's questions about local weather and farmland conditions rather than dwelling on his identity. Sylvester was grateful beyond measure for that small courtesy. Loaded with supplies, he drove out of town along a narrow road that gradually opened up to a vista of wide, open fields. Cows grazed in the distance, low hills rising beyond them in silhouettes against the dimming sky. A mailbox bearing the faded numbers of his new address stood at the junction of a winding dirt road. As he turned onto that track, the headlights revealed stretches of wooden fencing, some of it old and in need of repair. The barn he had seen in photographs stood at the end of the lane, its paint flaking in places. Beside it rose a single windmill, spinning slowly in the evening breeze, accompanied by the occasional squeak of ungreased metal. He parked outside the farmhouse. Its porch sagged a bit, and the paint looked worn, but the structure itself was sturdy, the windows shining dimly in the dusk. Stepping onto the porch, he fished a new ring of keys from his jacket pocket, inserted one into the old door lock, and pushed. The door creaked open to reveal a simple interior, modest furniture, a scattering of wooden chairs, a couch that had likely served the previous owner for decades. Dust motes swirled in the fading sunlight. This, he realized, was his new sanctuary. The first few nights in the farmhouse were a mix of rest and restless reflection. He set up a small bed in one corner of the main room, sleeping near a window that overlooked the front field. It felt strangely freeing to awaken at dawn, the golden light washing over fields that stretched as far as his eyes could see. He drank his coffee in silence, listening to birds greet the day. Instead of lines of fans or the beeping of film set walkie-talkies, he heard only the wind rustling through tall grass and the distant calls of crows perched on the fence posts. Once he had settled, he began the process of truly building a life on the ranch. Local contractors helped him evaluate the property, giving quotes on what it would cost to repair fences, upgrade the electrical wiring in the barn, and patch the farmhouse roof. Though money was not an immediate obstacle, Sylvester insisted on doing as much of the labor as he could by himself. He wanted to feel the ache in his arms after hammering in nails and the sweat that dripped down his forehead while lugging boards across the yard. This was far removed from the life of carefully choreographed gym workouts and personal trainers. Here, progress was tangible, measured by battered tools and sore muscles. One of the first things he did was adopt a few animals. He started small, a pair of goats, some hens for fresh eggs, and a friendly mutt from the local shelter. The dog, a mixture of shepherd and retriever, took to him instantly. It followed him everywhere, tail wagging, as though it understood that Sylvester was in need of a true companion. The devotion in its eyes made him smile in a way he hadn't in years. He named it Buddy, an uncomplicated name for an uncomplicated friend. Work on the ranch advanced slowly but steadily. Mornings began early, with Sylvester feeding the animals, checking the perimeter fence, and jotting down tasks for the day in a notebook. Afternoons saw him either in town buying supplies, a spool of barbed wire, a new hammer, sacks of feed, or hauling lumber around the property. He discovered a serene fishing spot along a creek that cut through the land's southern end, its water running clear and cold over smooth stones. In the evenings, after a day of physical labor, he would head there with a simple rod, content to let the hours pass in silence. Buddy would sit nearby, ears perked, as if standing guard. The sense of contentment, the unhurried pace, these were the things he'd spent years longing for without fully knowing it. Neighbors began to recognize him when he passed by. Some greeted him with a cautious wave, others with a friendly remark about the weather. They knew, of course, who he was. His face and voice were unmistakable. But they respected his choice to live among them quietly, never prodding him about Hollywood or the accolades that once surrounded his name. Perhaps a few harbored curiosity, but they left him to his solitude. It took months of hard work, but the ranch began to feel like a refuge untainted by the past. The barn received a fresh coat of red paint, the fences, though still worn in spots, stood straighter. By the time spring arrived, the fields had burst into vibrant life, and Buddy roamed them joyously, occasionally chasing rabbits or herding the goats in awkward patterns. Each morning, Sylvester would sip coffee on the porch, gazing at the horizon as the sunlight slowly revealed the world he was shaping with his own two hands. This tranquility had become his new identity: no paparazzi, no lines of fans, no interviews. Just the cry of hawks overhead and the gentle murmur of the creek as it meandered toward distant hills. Sometimes he reflected on the path that had brought him here, the years of intense filming schedules, nights spent memorizing lines, the red carpet events, the forced smiles for cameras. He didn't regret his accomplishments, but the sense that he had missed something essential often shadowed him. Now, on the ranch, he believed he had found that something, a chance to be a man at peace, a man content with the daily rhythms of honest work and quiet nights. He particularly cherished his interactions with the townsfolk. The local diner, with its grease-laden breakfasts and a waitress who always wore her hair in a tall beehive style, became a place he could visit without feeling the weight of stardom. He'd talk to the farmer next to him at the counter about fertilizer, or to the old veteran sipping coffee alone about the unpredictability of summer storms. The fact that he was once a big-name celebrity seemed irrelevant. People here measured a man more by how he treated others than by any superficial glimmer of status. Yet life, unpredictable as it is, sometimes has a way of intruding on one's chosen peace. For all the ranch's serenity, for all the kindness of the locals, the world remained what it was, a place where cruelty could intersect even the most tranquil corners. And so it was, on a mid-afternoon in high summer, that Sylvester first caught sight of trouble barreling down the long dirt road to his property. He was sitting on a rocking chair on the porch, Buddy lying at his feet, panting softly in the heat. A plume of dust rose in the distance, drawing closer. As the shape of a large pickup truck emerged, the rumble of its engine shattered the usual quiet. Sylvester stood, a knot forming in his stomach. This was no neighbor's beat-up farm vehicle. The truck radiated a different energy, oversized tires kicking up gravel, tinted windows obscuring whoever was inside. When it finally screeched to a halt at the gate to his ranch, Sylvester noticed 4 young men stepping out. Their clothes were not made for farm labor: designer jeans, crisp shirts, sunglasses that probably cost more than some ranchers earned in a month. They stood with an air of arrogance, as though the land beneath their feet belonged to them by default. Buddy rose, ears flattened, sensing something amiss. Sylvester approached the fence, uneasy. The leader of the group, a tall, lean man with a vicious smirk, wasted no time on pleasantries. He demanded entry, suggesting they wanted to explore the ranch, just for fun, he claimed, though his expression implied something else entirely. Sylvester's instincts told him these were not visitors in search of honest conversation or curiosity about rural life. Everything about their posture, their condescending tone, suggested trouble. Politely but firmly, he declined, telling them this was private land. A tension crackled in the air, and the men's stance turned predatory. The leader's eyes hardened. He sneered, making it clear that he didn't expect refusal. Rather than continue the argument, Sylvester stayed calm, repeating that they had no business here. But the man grabbed a beer bottle from the truck bed and hurled it at Sylvester. The glass shattered near his boots, spraying shards across the ground. A curse-laden threat followed: let them in, or face dire consequences. Buddy growled low in his throat, but Sylvester gestured for him to remain back. Keeping his voice measured, Sylvester warned the intruders that they were courting a conflict they wouldn't appreciate. However, the men only snickered. They hopped back into their truck as if to leave, revving the engine obnoxiously while spinning the tires in the dirt. Sylvester exhaled, thinking the confrontation might have ended. Yet the moment he let his guard down, the truck reversed sharply, then roared forward, slamming into his gate. Metal and wood snapped under the impact, a horrific screech piercing the air. Sylvester stood in shocked fury as the gate collapsed in a twisted heap. The pickup surged onto his property, the driver whooping as though it was nothing more than a thrilling game. Something primal blazed inside Sylvester at the violation of his sanctuary. He sprinted toward the truck, adrenaline surging, shoving open the driver's door before any of them could respond. The next seconds became a blur of fists and curses. He yanked the driver out, delivering a punch that connected with a sickening crack against the man's nose. Two of the others lunged at him, but his reflexes, honed by years of conditioning, kicked in. Elbows and knees flew, and within moments, two men howled in pain, clutching broken arms or dislocated shoulders. But the fourth circled around, unseen in the melee. Sylvester had just enough time to glimpse the raised baseball bat before it crashed into the side of his head. A white-hot explosion of pain filled his skull, buckling his knees. The world swam, voices echoing as he collapsed. Gravel bit into his cheek, consciousness slipping from his grasp. Darkness claimed him. He awoke to acrid smoke that stung his nose and lungs. At first, disorientation blocked all thought. He knew only that every inch of his body ached, and his arms were twisted painfully behind his back. Something around his wrists bit into his flesh. A rope, perhaps. Or zip ties. His temple throbbed where the bat had connected, each heartbeat sending fresh waves of agony through his skull. Coughing, he struggled to lift his head. Flames licked the night sky, crackling in the stables where the horses had been bedded down. The barn, his recently painted pride, was now an inferno, timbers crumbling in the blaze. Embers speckled the air like angry fireflies, illuminating the silhouettes of four men standing nearby. They laughed and shouted, brandishing bottles of beer. Their stance and body language were exultant, as if they were celebrating the destruction. He tried to move, but realized his legs were bound as well. With a sinking dread, he recognized that he was entirely at their mercy. Summoning a ragged breath, he rolled onto his side to peer through the haze. Buddy. Where was Buddy? A wave of panic coursed through him as he remembered the dog's defiant growl. Had Buddy escaped? Or worse? Anxiety dug hooks into his mind, fueling a desperate hope that somehow his loyal companion had fled into the darkness. A stinging voice broke through the roar of the flames. One of the men turned, raising a half-empty bottle to his lips before kicking dirt across Sylvester's boots. Derision etched itself into the man's posture as he stepped closer, his sneer illuminated by the flickering glow of the fire. Sylvester managed to twist away from the man's foot, but the ropes offered little slack. The man lifted his bottle in a mocking toast, muttering something that was lost beneath the din. Suddenly, the ringleader, the one with the broken nose, courtesy of Sylvester's punch, staggered forward, pressing a pistol to Sylvester's temple. The stench of alcohol wafted from the man's breath. He barked an insult, but Sylvester's ears still rang from the blow to his head, making it difficult to parse the words. However, the meaning was clear enough. This was meant to be a demonstration of power. The intruders had completely taken over the ranch, turning it into their personal playground of violence. Then, without any sign of mercy or hesitation, the man signaled his associates to drag something out from behind the scorched remains of a wooden cart. Two of them pulled Buddy into view. The dog's tail was tucked, eyes wide with fear. Buddy whimpered as one of the men gripped him by the collar, pointing a handgun to the side of his head. Sylvester fought the ropes, ignoring the pain in his wrists and the throbbing in his skull. He tried to shout, his voice was raw, nearly lost in the smoky air. His pleas went unheard or unheeded. Time slowed to a heartbeat as the shot rang out. Buddy jerked, then collapsed onto the ground. A spasm coursed through the dog's body, and Sylvester roared in anguish, tears mingling with the ash on his cheeks. The men only hooted, enthralled by their own cruelty. That heartbreak overshadowed the pain of his injuries, overshadowed even the immediate danger of the flames. In that instant, he vowed retribution with a silent ferocity that cut deeper than any words. Finished with their little show, the men turned and ambled back toward their truck, howling in triumph. One tossed his beer bottle into the raging fire before they piled inside. The engine revved, headlights flashing across the wrecked yard as they swerved away through the ruined gate. Soon, only the crackle of burning wood remained, punctuated by the frantic screams of livestock still trapped somewhere in the collapsing barn. Sylvester forced himself to keep breathing, in and out, though his grief threatened to swallow him whole. Minutes stretched into hours as he lay bound on the ground, watching helplessly as the flames consumed the outbuildings he had so painstakingly restored. He coughed repeatedly, black smoke searing his throat. Only when the fire began to die down, long after the barn's roof had collapsed into a heap of embers, did he manage to twist his wrists at an angle that loosened the rope. Bit by bit, ignoring searing friction on his skin, he worked his hands free. Staggering upright, he nearly collapsed again from the dizziness that surged through him. The blow to his temple had left him unsteady, and he gritted his teeth to maintain consciousness. Fighting nausea, he knelt beside Buddy. The dog's body was limp, eyes half open, the fur sticky with blood. Tremors of grief overtook Sylvester, yet no tears fell. The intensity of his anguish was beyond tears, it was a raw, hollow ache that consumed every nerve, a devastation that boiled into ferocious resolve. He lifted Buddy's body in his arms and carried it away from the scorching heat of the barn, near a large oak tree that stood on the edge of the property. There, beneath the thick roots, he dug a grave using his bare hands and a broken shovel blade he found in the rubble. It took him the better part of the night, each motion laced with heartbreak and determination. When the grave was done, he laid Buddy to rest, placing a small river stone at the head as a makeshift marker. The final patting of earth felt like a vow, sealed in the hush of pre-dawn. Exhausted and battered, he crawled into the farmhouse. Miraculously, the flames had not reached it. Inside, he gathered some bandages for the gash on his temple, grimacing as he cleaned the dried blood from his face. One glance in the mirror revealed a man he scarcely recognized, soot-streaked, eyes wild with pain, jaw clenched in fury. He slumped onto a chair in the kitchen, wincing at every bruise and contusion that flared with movement. Only then did he allow himself to shed a few silent tears, not just for Buddy, but for the dream that had gone up in smoke. His sanctuary had been violated. His animals, a handful that remained, milled nervously outside, spooked by the night's violence. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would see to them properly. For now, he needed rest, even though nightmares lurked in the corners of his mind. A few hours later, just as the sun was cresting the horizon, the county fire department arrived. Some neighbors must have seen the flames in the middle of the night and called it in, but it was far too late to save anything. Charred frameworks, twisted sheets of metal, ash where there had once been wood, these were all that remained of the stables and the barn. A couple of firefighters approached Sylvester with wary expressions. They asked if he needed medical assistance. He declined, though he allowed them to check his vital signs. He lied, telling them he had no idea who the attackers were, only that they had come to cause destruction. Deep down, he suspected the truth. These men were from powerful families or had powerful allies, the type that the local authorities might hesitate to cross. As the firefighters departed, the local sheriff arrived in a dusty cruiser. Sylvester stared out the window as the man stepped onto the porch, removed his hat, and gave a somber knock. The sheriff's face was lined, his eyes tired, as though he'd seen too many tragedies for one lifetime. Sylvester let him in, recounted the terror of the night before in clipped phrases. He expected outrage or some promise of swift justice. Instead, the sheriff looked even more burdened than before. In hushed tones, the sheriff explained that the men who had attacked him were likely members of a notorious group, sons of wealthy families that donated generously to local campaigns, perhaps even had ties to state-level officials. While he abhorred what they had done, the sheriff confided that his hands were tied. There had been other incidents, other victims, but each time, the men had evaded real consequences. If they had stooped to brutality once, they would likely do it again. Sylvester's anger flared. "Then do something," he snapped, ignoring the pain that flared in his skull. But the sheriff only shook his head. He mentioned the possibility of Sylvester relocating, warning him that the situation could escalate if he stayed and tried to fight back. The suggestion was a bitter pill. He had come here seeking a life of peace, and now he was being urged to flee again. The sheriff left with an apologetic shrug, leaving behind a man who felt more alone than ever. For a moment, Sylvester weighed the idea of packing up and leaving. The ranch had been scorched, his companion lost. He had enough money to start fresh somewhere else. But then he remembered Buddy's trusting gaze, the fields he had tilled, the barn he had labored to restore. The men had shattered his dream, and in doing so, awakened something dark and unyielding inside him. Whether or not the sheriff would help, he intended to exact his own brand of justice. A life spent portraying heroes had taught him a few things about resolve. Now, off-screen and with savage reality pressing in on him, that resolve would manifest in ways no scriptwriter could have foreseen. He spent the next days sorting through the wreckage. Some of the cows had fled into the neighboring fields, returning at dusk, drawn by the memory of feed and water. A couple of the horses had been rescued by neighbors who saw them running, manes singed from the fire. Others had perished, their remains found among the ashes. Each discovery weighed on Sylvester like an anvil. While burying them, his heart grew harder, each shovel of dirt fueling an unspoken promise. In town, whispers circulated about the incident. People offered condolences, though no one seemed willing to stand against the men known for violence. One older farmer quietly left a bag of horse feed at the farmhouse doorstep. Another neighbor dropped off some extra plywood for makeshift repairs. Sylvester accepted each gesture but kept his emotions tightly controlled. Any sign of gratitude felt overshadowed by the plan forming in his mind. He began collecting information, piece by piece. A rumor here, a slip of conversation there. He visited a retired deputy who lived in a mobile home on the far edge of town, a man rumored to know the underbelly of local politics. Over strong coffee, the deputy recounted stories of intimidation and backroom deals, scrawling names and addresses on a scrap of paper. "They got everyone in their pocket," the deputy muttered, voice shaking with resentment. "But if you're real set on revenge, you better be smarter than them. And you better be ready for the consequences." Sylvester understood the warning. He nodded, took the paper, and left. That very night, he sat in the farmhouse among flickering candles. Power had been partially knocked out, and pored over the names. The four men from the truck each had ties to a powerful circle of local elites. The ringleader lived in a sprawling estate, protected by gates and armed guards. Another had a reputation for throwing wild parties on a yacht moored along a private marina. The other two were rumored to be connected through clubs, bars, and questionable deals that gave them access to mercenaries if needed. A seed of determination bloomed within him. He spent hours mapping out a plan in an old spiral notebook, listing resources he could acquire. Weapons, maybe. Disguises, if necessary. Means of infiltration into their guarded domains. Gone was the peaceable rancher who just wanted to fix fences. In his place stood a man shaped by fury and heartbreak, prepared to do whatever it took to avenge the death of his dog and the destruction of his home. Each passing day, the bruises on his body faded, replaced by a sharpened clarity of purpose. He would begin to hunt them, one by one, like a predator. He would bide his time, gather intelligence, and strike with a ferocity none of them expected. Blood had been spilled on his land, and he intended to repay it in kind. This was no script, no heroic monologue uttered in front of cameras. This was real life, where lines between right and wrong blurred, where a person's soul could shatter under the weight of tragedy. He had lost any illusions about forgiveness or the law's protection. The only justice he believed in now was the kind he could mete out with his own hands. As evening draped the sky in a cloak of purple and orange, he stepped outside the farmhouse. The crisp air stung his lungs. He walked to the makeshift grave under the oak tree, kneeling beside the small river stone that marked Buddy's resting place. For a long while, he stayed there, his expression unreadable. If there were tears left to shed, he hid them. Instead, he placed a hand on the earth and whispered a promise. "I'll make this right. They won't do this to anyone else. I swear it." The nights grew long, filled with clandestine preparations. Gone were the quiet evenings by the creek, fishing rod in hand. Now, Sylvester used the cover of darkness to prowl the outskirts of town, meeting contacts who sold firearms off the record, exchanging cash in dingy backrooms. The retired deputy's notes guided him to a few such people, men and women who had no fondness for the local elites and were willing to equip a stranger who sought payback. In those clandestine transactions, no one asked questions. It was safer that way. In the morning, he tended to the remnants of his ranch, feeding the surviving livestock, clearing rubble where he could, and patching the charred corner of the stable that hadn't fully collapsed. The physical labor anchored him, preventing him from getting lost in the swirl of rage that accompanied every memory of Buddy's final moment. But once the chores were done, he poured himself into what could only be called a reconnaissance operation. He needed to identify each of the 4 men precisely, where they slept, how they spent their time, whom they trusted for security. The easiest lead came from a rumor repeated among local barflies. The first man was planning a massive party at his opulent mansion just outside the county line. Known for indulging in excess, he would invite strippers, bodyguards, and other questionable individuals, ensuring an environment of intoxicated chaos. It struck Sylvester that such a setting, with its loud music and throngs of unwary revelers, might be the perfect place to launch a surprise assault. Yet he couldn't simply charge in. He needed to ensure that the other men would not be present as backup. Also, he had to confirm that the man in question was indeed one of the 4 who had destroyed his ranch. He drove past the mansion several times in a borrowed vehicle, tinted windows shielding him from view. High walls surrounded the estate, with a single large gate guarded by uniformed men. Sometimes he glimpsed lavish cars rolling through that gate, sports cars, limousines, black SUVs. Party guests, presumably. Through binoculars at dusk, he watched shadowy figures near the mansion's pool. The property boasted an enormous lawn, dotted with ornate statues and decorative fountains. At night, colored lights illuminated the grounds, flashing in sync with the music that throbbed just beyond the walls. The place felt like a self-contained kingdom of hedonism. Sylvester scouted potential entry points. A service gate at the rear admitted catering vans and maintenance crews. Over several evenings, he noted that staff vehicles were less thoroughly searched. A plan took shape. If he could pass as a member of the catering crew, he might slip in with minimal scrutiny, provided he did so when the party was at its peak. Once inside, he'd blend among the staff, waiting for the chance to isolate his target. He also needed to confirm the identity of his target. Was he the one who had threatened Sylvester with a pistol or the one who had thrown the bottle? Or perhaps he was the tall, wiry one who had circled with the bat. Each detail mattered because the men were seldom alone. If Sylvester attacked the wrong person in the wrong place, the entire plan could unravel before the real culprit faced justice. Yet the glimpses he caught through binoculars provided little clarity. He decided he'd have to rely on proximity once inside. He'd see the man's face up close. Recognition would be immediate. You never forget the person who helps destroy your world. The night of the party arrived. Sylvester wore a simple black uniform akin to a server's outfit, having purchased it secondhand. The battered pickup he now drove matched the kind of vehicles caterers used for quick deliveries, unremarkable, covered in dings and rust. He waited until the flow of partygoers peaked, around 11 p.m., when the guard's attention likely waned due to the continuous arrivals. With a set of forged documents that listed supposed catering supplies, he eased his truck up to the service gate. The guard, busy with a phone conversation, glanced quickly at the papers and waved him in without thorough inspection. He parked near the estate's enormous kitchen entrance, where other catering staff hustled in and out, carrying trays of expensive appetizers and bottles of liquor. Flashing lights spilled from large windows across the manicured lawn. The thumping bass from inside vibrated the very air. Sylvester grabbed a crate of supplies, mostly random items he'd stuffed in, and carried it through a side door. In the hallway, a swirl of servers, bartenders, and a few stray guests blocked the path. The smell of perfume, cologne, and alcohol mixed into a heady miasma. His heart pounded. This was no film set, where missteps could be cut in post-production. Danger lurked around every corner. If someone recognized him or grew suspicious, the entire mission could fail in seconds. But necessity drove him forward. He moved with feigned confidence, setting the crate down on a counter. Then, adopting the brisk, purposeful stride of staff who had no time to loiter, he wove deeper into the mansion. The first floor was an expanse of gaudy extravagance. Marble floors, golden chandeliers, plush furniture imported from who knew where. Rooms were filled with gyrating dancers, flashing disco lights, and a swirl of nearly overwhelming music. Strobe effects made the throng appear almost demonic in flickers of color and shadow. Guests shouted to be heard, drinks sloshing in their hands. Bodyguards in dark suits stood at strategic points, scanning the crowd with the stoic intensity of professionals. Through a haze of dancers, Sylvester glimpsed the shape of a man who might have been the target, but the strobing lights made it impossible to be sure. He needed to find a vantage point. Making his way down a corridor, he located a circuit breaker room. He had studied the estate's blueprint, gleaned from old planning documents at the county office. Public records were a goldmine if one knew where to look. Sure enough, there was a small electrical panel that controlled the lighting in the northern wing. He contemplated cutting the power to the entire mansion, but that would likely draw too much attention at once. Instead, he decided to wait until he could confirm his target's location, then create a partial blackout to sow confusion. Returning to the main area, he headed upstairs, taking note of the staff stairwell leading to the second floor. Up there, the atmosphere was more subdued, reserved for VIPs seeking a quieter space or indulging in private amusements. Dim lighting, plush carpets, and the faint aroma of cigars replaced the pounding music below. Sylvester proceeded cautiously, pressing himself against the walls whenever a group passed. He overheard bits of conversation that made him seethe inside, talk of paying off local authorities, of humiliating nobodies from the sticks, delivered with the arrogance of men who believed they were above consequence. Finally, he glimpsed a cluster of individuals entering a lounge area. A tall, lean figure with a bandaged nose stood at their center, a drink in one hand while the other rummaged in his pocket. Light from a crystal lamp illuminated his face for a split second. Sylvester's stomach twisted. This was definitely one of them, the sneering man who had goaded on the attack. Bruises and the bandage across the bridge of his nose suggested he was still healing from a broken nose. Sylvester's memory recalled the satisfying crunch when he'd landed a punch in the chaos back on the ranch. Anger threatened to cloud his judgment, but he forced himself to remain focused. If he confronted the man right now, the bodyguards would intervene, guns drawn. He needed a moment of isolation, or at least fewer eyes. Shifting to a vantage in the hallway, he watched them enter a closed-off room with muffled music. Moments later, two strippers passed by, giggling, carrying trays of champagne. They knocked at the door, and someone inside let them in, presumably to entertain the group. Sylvester exhaled. He moved back to the staff stairwell and descended to the breaker room he'd spotted earlier. He flipped a switch that killed power to the lounge area while leaving the rest of the mansion lit. Instantly, confused shouts echoed from upstairs. He then rushed back up, weaving through the staff corridor so that he could approach the lounge from a side door. In the darkness, security would be disoriented, and the guests might blame an electrical glitch. The timing had to be perfect. The hallway leading to the lounge was plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the dim emergency lights at floor level. Sylvester saw the beam of a flashlight dancing from behind the door, accompanied by male voices cursing. He heard the clink of glass and a scuffle as someone stumbled. 2 heavy bodyguards stepped into the corridor, each armed with a flashlight and presumably a firearm. They were barking into earpieces, demanding to know why the power had failed. Sylvester ducked behind a corner, heart hammering. As one guard passed, he lunged, hooking an arm around the man's neck in a chokehold. The guard managed a muffled grunt before Sylvester squeezed with calculated force, cutting off air and blood flow. The guard slumped unconscious in seconds. Gently, Sylvester lowered him to the floor and took the man's pistol. The second guard, hearing the struggle, called out. Sylvester fired a single shot, silenced by a makeshift suppressor, striking the guard's shoulder. The man dropped with a groan, the flashlight spinning across the floor. Now the corridor was temporarily his. Sylvester stepped over the guard, ignoring the man's groans. He reached the lounge door. Inside, chaos reigned, the music had cut off, people were shouting, and a few phone screens glowed as guests tried to light the space. He entered swiftly. The man with the bandaged nose was leaning against a wall, a stripper clutching his arm, whispering anxious questions. Another bodyguard lay sprawled on a leather couch, incapacitated by the darkness or perhaps too drunk to respond quickly. Sylvester seized the bandaged man's arm, yanking him away from the stripper. Confusion turned to terror on the man's face. Even in the gloom, recognition flared in his eyes. He tried to draw a weapon, but Sylvester wrested it from him, slamming the gun aside. Their scuffle sent a chair crashing. Screams erupted. The strippers backed away, flattening themselves against the wall. Sylvester forced the man through a side door into an unlit hallway, ignoring his slurred protests. Blood roared in Sylvester's ears as he pinned the man to the wall, pressing a forearm against his throat. A moment of clarity, he recalled every detail of the ranch's destruction, every mocking laugh. The man's eyes glistened with a mix of fear and fury. Sylvester felt no mercy. With a single motion, he withdrew a knife from his belt, its blade glinting faintly. The man choked out a half-formed plea, but Sylvester slashed across his throat in a swift, brutal stroke. Hot blood sprayed onto the floor, and the man's hands flailed, grasping at Sylvester's arm before sliding away, leaving crimson streaks. Within seconds, the man collapsed, eyes vacant, the bandage on his nose soaked through with red. Heavy footsteps pounded in the corridor behind them. Sylvester realized he had only seconds before the rest of the bodyguards converged. Heart thudding, he let the man's body drop, stepping over the widening pool of blood. He sprinted down the hallway, shoulders grazing the walls, searching for an exit. The first door he tried led to a dimly lit bedroom. Wrong. Shouts filled the air, "He's here. Over here." Gritting his teeth, he darted back into the corridor and recognized the path he had taken earlier. Slipping through the staff stairwell, he managed to evade direct confrontation, though he exchanged a few wild shots with a guard who glimpsed him from the far end of the hall. Bullets cracked into the walls, splintering wood. Downstairs, the music and lights continued as normal, the guests unaware that murder had just occurred above them. He found a side exit leading to the parking area used by catering staff. Emerging into the night, he inhaled the cool air with a tremor of relief. He rushed to his truck, jumped in, and started the engine. Tires squealed as he sped toward the gate, but the guard there had already been alerted. A barrage of gunfire erupted, pinging off the truck's side panel. He ducked, pressing the accelerator. The gate, a simple steel barrier, was lowered, but the momentum of the truck broke through in a shriek of metal. Once on the open road, he gunned the vehicle, leaving behind a swirl of dust and the adrenaline-laden chaos of that mansion. For a few miles, he just drove, forcing himself to breathe, to take stock. Blood splattered his uniform. He felt a stinging ache along his side, likely a bullet had grazed him. Yet the overriding sensation was a fierce satisfaction mixed with trembling shock. One of the men who had torched his barn, murdered his dog, and threatened his life had now faced the retribution he so richly deserved. Sylvester stared at his shaking hands, feeling the weight of what he'd done. There was no turning back from this path. He had crossed the threshold into a world where violence was the only language left that these men understood. He pulled onto a side road and doused the truck's headlights, waiting to ensure no pursuers were on his tail. After a tense 15 minutes, he heard nothing but the night silence, broken only by crickets. He exhaled a ragged breath. Two thoughts warred in his mind. The first was the hope that Buddy might rest more peacefully now that one murderer had been avenged. The second was the cold realization that 3 remained, and they would be forewarned. He had to be even more cautious from now on. In the darkness, he whispered words he'd never said aloud, "One down." Then, remembering Buddy, he added, voice choking, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Above, the moon hung like a silent witness, offering neither comfort nor judgment. Gritting his teeth, Sylvester started the engine again, steering onto the highway with a renewed sense of purpose. He would find the others. No matter how they tried to hide, or what armies of bodyguards they hired, he would bring them to the same end that had befallen the first. Only then could he face the memory of his loyal companion's last breath and know that justice, in whatever flawed form, had been served. He spent the next few days lying low, shifting from one cheap motel to another, paying cash and avoiding places that required a credit card or ID. The local news buzzed with rumors of a shocking killing at a private mansion. Anonymous sources described a masked intruder who had slipped past security, targeting a specific guest with lethal precision. Some speculated about gang warfare, others whispered about a personal vendetta. Sylvester listened to the radio reports in the truck, grim-faced but resolute. Authorities were investigating, of course. So were private security firms hired by the wealthy families who had reason to fear they might be next. The circle of 4 was now a circle of 3. But the second man, according to the deputy's notes, favored a life of luxury aboard a yacht. He and the others had apparently enjoyed many weekends on that vessel, partying in international waters, away from the oversight of local law enforcement. If he was indeed the same one who had gleefully taken part in the ranch raid, the path to him ran across the ocean. That presented a whole new level of complexity. Sylvester was no stranger to boats, but infiltration at sea was a different game from sneaking into a mansion. He returned to the retired deputy, seeking more details. Sitting at the cramped table in the deputy's small trailer, the 2 men pored over newspaper clippings, old pictures, and scribbled notes. There was a mention of a private marina along a wealthy section of coastline, a place known for its lenient policies toward high-paying clients. Extra slip fees often meant no questions asked about the comings and goings of large vessels. The second man, rumored to be a braggart, frequently boasted about the parties he hosted on his prized yacht, complete with exotic entertainment, expensive liquor, and even private security to ward off prying eyes. Sylvester understood the need to adapt. Taking on a well-protected target on open water meant he'd have to orchestrate either a stealth approach or a scenario that forced the man into a vulnerable position. The idea of igniting a crisis, a fire, for instance, surfaced in his mind. Fire on a boat was every seafarer's nightmare. It triggered panic and immediate evacuation. In that chaos, he might isolate the target. But to pull it off, he needed supplies and a methodical plan. For days, he staked out the marina in question. Perched in a nondescript sedan, binoculars on the passenger seat, he watched the comings and goings of wealthy boat owners. He noted the hum of security patrols, the angle of cameras along the marina's entrance, and the times at which staff changed shifts. Through the lens, he glimpsed a large yacht moored at the far dock, a sleek, opulent vessel glimmering under the sunlight. The name on its hull matched the notes from the deputy's files. He spotted deckhands loading crates, presumably for a grand voyage or another weekend party. If the occupant was indeed his target, he'd be on board soon enough, likely surrounded by sycophants, just like the first man had been. He recognized that mounting a direct assault in broad daylight was reckless. Instead, he waited until late at night, when the marina's activities slowed. He watched from a vantage point along a nearby cliff, the moonlit sea stretching out below. The yacht's lights were a bright line of color amid the dark water, shadows moving on the deck. Party music occasionally drifted across the tide, though it was faint at this distance. Through the binoculars, he thought he glimpsed his target, a tall figure in a pristine shirt, leaning over the yacht's rail while talking animatedly to someone. If it was truly him, the man was blissfully unaware of the danger coalescing in the shadows. After carefully timing the marina's security patrols, Sylvester acquired a small inflatable boat from a local fisherman who didn't ask many questions. He added a portable outboard motor, some rope, a grappling hook, and an assortment of flammable materials that he stowed in watertight containers. Fire would be the key to drawing the man out of his fortress at sea. Once more, he found himself preparing a violent deception, all for the sake of avenging his farm and his companion. When the night of action arrived, the yacht was anchored slightly offshore, a short distance from the main docks. Shuttles ferried guests back and forth, illuminating the water with their running lights. Sylvester used the darkness to his advantage, creeping along the coastline in the inflatable boat with the engine at its lowest setting. The ocean waves slapped gently against the boat's rubber sides, masking much of the motor's noise. Far ahead, neon lights pulsed on the yacht's upper deck, where he could see silhouettes of people dancing. He waited until well after midnight, the time when intoxication typically peaked and vigilance waned. Then, slipping into a wet suit, he eased the inflatable boat behind a rocky outcrop. He doused the motor and glided on the currents until he was close enough to swim. Securing the boat to a rock, he took a small watertight bag of supplies and dove into the water. The ocean's chill startled him, but adrenaline propelled him forward. He swam beneath the surface for short bursts, surfacing to glance at his target. The hull loomed, gleaming in the moonlight, as he approached. With careful strokes, he reached the rear of the yacht. There, a maintenance ladder extended just above the waterline. He clung to the rung, waiting for any sign of patrolling guards. Music thumped from above, and occasionally, a swirl of laughter cascaded over the deck railing. It seemed the party was in full swing, which was precisely what he'd hoped. The watchers would be more concerned about preventing gatecrashers from above, not from below. He climbed the ladder just enough to attach canisters of flammable gel to the hull near key points, areas where ventilation shafts or engine components might ignite easily. The plan was to trigger a small blaze that would create panic but not so large that it sank the yacht immediately. He didn't want the vessel to go under before he found his target. One by one, he fixed the canisters, mindful of the ocean spray. Then, after verifying no guards were directly above, he slipped back into the water and returned to his inflatable boat, nerves jangling like a live wire. Safely in the boat, he activated a remote ignition device connected to the canisters. Within moments, a flicker of flame caught his eye near the stern, rapidly intensifying into a swirl of smoke. Alarms blared from the yacht, and the music halted abruptly. Spotlights swept across the water, searching for the cause of the fire. Sylvester remained in the gloom behind the rocky outcrop, out of the light's reach. As predicted, chaos erupted on deck. Crew members rushed around, barking instructions. Guests screamed, jostling for life jackets or trying to board the lifeboats. The typical arrogance that might have reigned here vanished in the face of immediate danger. Over the hum of confusion, he heard a man's voice, likely the captain, shouting about compartment fires and telling everyone to evacuate. If his target was indeed on board, he would show up soon in the scramble for safety. Sylvester readied the inflatable boat, drifting closer to the yacht while still hidden in darkness. A security craft appeared, scanning the area, but the swirling smoke combined with the glare of onboard spotlights to create a confusing visual soup. Meanwhile, one of the yacht's lifeboats lowered unsteadily, carrying a cluster of panicked guests. Another followed. Finally, the real prize emerged, a lifeboat holding the second gangster. Tall and frantic, flanked by bodyguards trying to maintain order. The gangster was yelling, though his words were lost beneath the chaos. A shock of recognition jolted Sylvester. Even from a distance, the man's posture and expression were unmistakable, the same sadistic glee now twisted into terror. It was indeed one of the four who had invaded the ranch. He let them lower into the water, watching as they tried to motor away from the burning yacht. The security craft was momentarily occupied with rescuing others, leaving the gangster's lifeboat somewhat isolated. Sylvester steered his inflatable boat in a wide arc, using the gloom to mask his approach. The gangster's lifeboat drifted, motor sputtering as someone fumbled with its operation. A couple of bodyguards brandished flashlights, scanning the waves. They likely feared an external threat but didn't expect a single, stealthy attacker closing in from behind. With well-timed caution, Sylvester drew alongside, the hum of his small outboard lost in the cacophony of alarms and flames. In a burst of movement, he vaulted over the side of the lifeboat, landing amidst startled screams. Before the bodyguards could react, he whipped out a pistol fitted with a homemade suppressor, firing 2 shots in quick succession. One guard collapsed immediately, the other stumbled over the side, plunging into the churning waves. Shrieking, a woman scrabbled to the opposite end of the lifeboat, while a pair of intoxicated guests stared in shock, paralyzed. The gangster tried to draw a weapon, but Sylvester kicked it from his hand, sending it clattering against the lifeboat's metal floor. Seizing the gangster's collar, Sylvester pinned him against the side of the craft. For an instant, their eyes locked. Recognition ignited a primal terror in the gangster, who sputtered a nonsensical plea for mercy. No mercy existed in Sylvester's mind, not after the Barnes, the dog's murder, the laughter he still heard echoing in nightmares. "Don't, please," the gangster managed to choke out, but Sylvester cut him off by forcing his head under the water. The man thrashed, arms flailing, trying to claw his way up. Sylvester held him down, ignoring the frantic bubbles that rose to the surface. After a few long moments, he lifted the gangster's head, letting him gasp for air and spew salt water. Then, with cold finality, Sylvester repeated the action. This time, he kept the gangster submerged until the flailing ceased. The body went limp, drifting in the tide that lapped around the lifeboat. Sylvester let go, letting the corpse slip away. A stunned hush fell over the remaining passengers. One tried to inch toward the radio, presumably to call for help, but a single glare from Sylvester froze them in place. He then vaulted back into his inflatable boat, started the motor, and sped off before the security craft could catch sight of him. Smoke from the yacht's fire drifted across the ocean, casting a veil over everything. He navigated the inflatable craft toward the rocky coastline, heart pounding. The second gangster's end felt somehow more visceral than the first. Perhaps it was the personal nature of drowning, or the savage memory of Buddy's terrified eyes. Either way, there was no room in him for remorse. With the group's second member gone, the once indomitable quartet was halved. In the following hours, as he deflated the inflatable boat and stowed away his gear in the trunk of a borrowed car, he listened to the distant sirens and saw the glow of emergency lights across the water. The fire on the yacht raged on, though rescue teams would likely manage to save most of the vessel. The newscasts, he imagined, would talk of a mysterious tragedy at sea. Maybe they'd label it sabotage or an accident. Regardless, the man who had stood by at the ranch, mocking and terrorizing innocent creatures, was gone, just another casualty of his own arrogance. Sylvester was exhausted yet wired, adrenaline surging in waves that left him shaky. Pulling onto a quiet highway, he forced himself to remain calm. He needed a safe place to rest, but caution dictated he change vehicles again, ditching any traceable links. He recalled a remote motel 2 towns over. Known for renting rooms by the week, no questions asked. That would be his next stop. As he drove, dawn began to paint the sky with pale streaks of pink and orange. He recognized the irony that the world looked so peaceful, even though he had just committed an act of brutal vengeance. 2 men remained alive from the original 4, presumably now in full panic. They might guess he was coming, might bolster their defenses, hire mercenaries, or vanish entirely. But that was a future problem. For the moment, Sylvester clung to the knowledge that the circle was even smaller. The brutality of the ranch invasion avenged another step further. A wave of grief and relief mingled inside him. If Buddy could see him now, would the dog even recognize the man he had become? He had once been a gentle caretaker of the land, content to mend fences and fish in the creek. Now he was an instrument of vengeance, a harbinger of death for those who had destroyed his peace. There was no turning back. He quietly muttered a promise to Buddy's memory as the early sun shone across the horizon. "I won't stop until they all pay." The days that followed felt like standing in the eye of a storm. Beneath the surface calm, there was a palpable tension. Sylvester anticipated a backlash from the wealthy families behind the men he'd targeted. He was certain they would not remain passive while their scions were systematically eliminated. Indeed, rumors soon trickled in through the retired deputy and various under-the-radar informants. The last 2 had joined forces, each too frightened to remain alone. They had likely deduced that their assailant, though they might not know it was Sylvester specifically, was unstoppable if they stayed separated. It was no secret, then, that they pooled their resources to secure a veritable fortress. According to the whispers, they had purchased the services of a private mercenary outfit, men with paramilitary backgrounds who would gladly kill for a paycheck. The fortress was rumored to be a sprawling estate in another county, ringed by tall fences, surveillance cameras, and guard towers. High walls enclosed the property, and the gates were said to be bulletproof. The men, paranoid now, seldom ventured outside except in heavily armored vehicles, escorted by armed convoys. On one level, Sylvester felt a bleak satisfaction. They were scared. They should be. On another, he recognized that a direct assault would be suicide. He had to be smarter, more patient. A part of him resented the drawn-out process. He wanted closure, to finish this once and for all. Each night, he dreamed of the barn in flames, the smell of charred timber, and Buddy's final, silent stare. Each morning, he woke in a cold sweat, heart hammering as he recalled the vow he had made. He concealed himself in a safe house arranged by the retired deputy, a rundown cabin deep in the woods, accessible only by an overgrown dirt track. There, he spent hours fine-tuning weapons, cleaning firearms, and mapping out infiltration strategies. Stacks of paper, satellite printouts, and scribbled notes cluttered the small wooden table. Outside, pine trees whispered in the breeze, and the pungent scent of sap filled the air. Occasionally, a deer would wander by, peering curiously at the intruder in its forest domain. But Sylvester had no time for nature's peace. His focus lay entirely on the fortress that held the final 2 men. His first attempt at recon was a lesson in caution. He managed to get within half a mile of the estate's perimeter, disguised as a day laborer traveling in an old pickup. Yet even from that distance, he spotted the glint of sniper scopes along the walls, motion sensors that tracked passers-by, and guards patrolling with dogs. The entire property was a kill zone. He feigned a wrong turn, doing a 3-point turn on the gravel road, and left as quickly as he dared. Back at his safe house, he deliberated alternative approaches, storming the gate with an arsenal of weaponry, or perhaps an explosives-laden truck to blow a hole in the walls. But each scenario ended with him likely gunned down long before he reached his targets. They had placed themselves at the center of a small army, flush with finances that allowed them to fortify every vulnerability. If he tried the direct approach, they would probably greet him with overwhelming firepower. He needed a diversion. Something large enough to draw security forces away from the main building, perhaps forcing the men to hide in a panic room, or, ironically, flee into a location where he could intercept them with fewer guards. One potential advantage was the estate's reliance on electronics. If he could sabotage the power or disrupt communications, a wave of chaos might ensue. But even that alone might not separate the men from their formidable protectors. One night, while scanning the area using a high-powered telescope from a distant ridge, Sylvester spotted an entourage arriving, half a dozen vehicles, headlights cutting through the dusk, guards fanning out around a heavily tinted SUV. Men in tactical gear carried crates inside, possibly weapons or supplies. He noticed, too, the layout of the courtyard, wide, open, no cover. Perfectly designed for defenders to mow down attackers from the walls. He took copious notes on the timing of guard rotations. By his fifth night of observation, he knew the schedule by heart. Certain shifts changed at midnight, others at 4 a.m. Dogs patrolled the perimeter in pairs. Cameras scanned each sector in a continuous arc, no blind spots. The fortress appeared impenetrable. Still, he refused to concede that the men were out of reach. They had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves, a testament to their fear. That fear was his wedge. A new plan emerged. If the fortress was designed to repel an outside invasion, perhaps the best approach was infiltration from within. Sylvester considered forging an alliance with an insider, some mercenary or staff member disillusioned enough to be bribed. But that posed immense risks, and he had no guarantee such a person even existed. Another angle was to lure the men out with a ruse so enticing or so threatening that they'd leave the estate. That might mean exploiting something they prized even more than their own security. In his research, he discovered that the last two men were rumored to hold private financial documents, blackmail material, or other personal records locked away. He recalled from earlier chatter that at least one of them maintained a hidden stash of incriminating evidence used to manipulate local politicians. Perhaps their entire empire relied on those documents. If Sylvester could threaten that trove, they might emerge from their fortress to secure it. Alternatively, if he contrived a credible rumor that the authorities were about to raid the estate, they might flee. But all these ideas hinged on him orchestrating an elaborate deception. Despite the obstacles, time was not on his side. He could feel the tension building in the region. The local press began asking questions about unexplained killings. Private investigators, possibly ex-law enforcement, roamed the countryside, searching for leads on the killer. Even the retired deputy sensed the net tightening. "You can't hide forever," he warned. "Either you strike, or you vanish." In the end, Sylvester chose the path of direct infiltration, albeit with a carefully staged distraction. He spent days building improvised explosives from farming supplies and chemicals he acquired under assumed names. Nothing too large, just enough to simulate an attack at the rear of the compound. While the mercenaries rushed to repel this supposed assault, he would slip in through a less monitored section of the perimeter, aiming to reach the main house and corner the two men. The plan was bold, and the margin for error razor-thin. One miscalculation could see him riddled with bullets. Yet each time he doubted, he remembered Buddy's grave, the charred remains of the barn, the mocking laughter that had haunted him ever since. He had not come this far, had not spilled blood and risked his life, to abandon his mission now. The night of reckoning arrived quietly. A new moon rendered the sky pitch black. Sylvester parked his truck a mile from the estate, carefully unloading a bundle of timed explosives, rifles, extra ammunition, and a set of bolt cutters. Dressed in dark fatigues, face smeared with soot, he looked nothing like the rancher who once fixed fences under the midday sun. He looked like a soldier prepared for the final battle in a personal war. He made his approach on foot, hugging the tree line until he reached the estate's southwestern corner. A chain-link fence stood there, topped with razor wire. Cameras panned overhead. He attached a small mirror to his rifle barrel to monitor the camera's arc. Once it swept past, he darted forward, snipping the fence with the bolt cutters. The wire parted just enough for him to crawl through. He inched across the grass, heart pounding, as dogs barked in the distance. 10 minutes later, timed charges planted near the estate's far side detonated in quick succession. The dull thump echoed, the ground trembling slightly. Lights flared up in that direction, and search beams roved over the fence. From his vantage point, Sylvester watched as guards streamed toward the explosions, radio chatter spiking in urgent bursts. Shouts carried on the wind. The front courtyard, so heavily monitored before, now stood undermanned. He seized the opportunity, sprinting across the open space and ducking behind a row of manicured hedges near the entrance. Gunfire erupted from the rear fence, presumably guards firing at perceived intruders in the darkness. Sylvester's ruse had worked, for the moment. A large portion of security was now drawn away, leaving the main house vulnerable. He slipped through a side door that led into a lavish corridor. The interior was oppressively quiet compared to the commotion outside. Marble floors, high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, the same trappings of wealth he had witnessed in the previous mansions, only on a grander scale. He advanced carefully, rifle raised, stepping lightly. Muffled voices ahead signaled that at least some guards remained inside. Flattening himself against a wall, he listened to two men arguing. One insisted they should escort the bosses to the panic room, while the other said they needed more intel on what was happening outside. Sylvester waited until they passed by, then followed them from a distance. At an intersection of hallways, the men parted ways. Sylvester trailed the guard who spoke of the panic room. Through a series of doors, they came to a broad foyer from which a wide staircase led to a second-floor balcony. The guard trotted upstairs. Sylvester eased behind him, silent as a phantom. Halfway up, the guard paused, sensing something. He reached for a walkie-talkie, but Sylvester's rifle cracked in a subdued bark, one shot. The guard collapsed, tumbling down the steps. Blood spread across the polished marble. The gunshot echoed, so he swiftly pressed on, scanning every corner. He found a hallway with portraits and closed doors. A noise from behind one door drew his focus, a frantic command in a muffled voice. The final two men, perhaps. Sylvester braced himself. If they had indeed barricaded themselves in, they might be heavily armed or have a guard detail. But this was the moment for which he had come so far. He kicked the door open, gun raised. Inside was a spacious lounge filled with antique furniture and a fireplace. The last two men huddled in the corner, guns shaking in their hands. Behind them, four mercenaries formed a defensive line, weapons trained on the door. Sylvester dove behind a heavy oak table as bullets tore through the air, splintering wood. He fired back, forcing them to take cover behind an overturned sofa. One mercenary attempted to flank him, creeping around the room's perimeter. Sylvester heard the footsteps, turned, and squeezed the trigger. The mercenary dropped, his weapon clattering to the floor. Chaos seized the room. Smoke from gunfire hung in the air, stinging Sylvester's eyes. The final men screamed at the mercenaries to kill him, cursing, their bravado replaced by fear. Another burst of automatic fire peppered the table, sending shards flying. Sylvester rolled to the side, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. A bullet grazed his left arm, pain flaring. He clenched his teeth and pressed forward. In a desperate gamble, Sylvester lobbed a small flashbang across the sofa. The device detonated in a brilliant burst of light and deafening noise, disorienting everyone in the room. He seized the chance, vaulting over the table. Two mercenaries, blinded, staggered, arms flailing. He gunned them down without hesitation. The last mercenary was on the floor, ears ringing, fumbling with his weapon. Sylvester fired once, ending him. Now only the two men remained. They backed against the wall, firearms useless in their shaking hands. Sylvester advanced, the muzzle of his rifle fixed on them. Their eyes locked with his, reflecting sheer terror. One was short, stocky, face contorted in fear. The other was tall, already bruised from some earlier scuffle, perhaps with his own guards. Both were men who had laughed as his ranch burned, had watched Buddy die, had threatened him with death. They pleaded for mercy, babbling apologies, pointing fingers at each other. Their words clashed over one another, forming a dissonant chorus of cowardice. Sylvester felt no pity. The memory of the ranch's flames, the stench of burned wood and flesh, the final whimper of Buddy overshadowed all else. He pressed the rifle to the short man's chest, meeting his gaze. In it, he saw the reflection of his own transformation. He was no longer a farmer, no longer the gentle caretaker. He was retribution incarnate. He squeezed the trigger. The shot thundered. The short man's body pitched backwards, lifeless before hitting the floor. The tall man collapsed to his knees, sobbing, dropping his gun. He tried to crawl away, scraping at the polished floor. Sylvester followed, rifle unwavering. The man's pleas for forgiveness echoed uselessly in the carnage-strewn lounge. A final shot ended his words forever. For a long moment, Sylvester stood amid the blood and debris, rifle still clenched in his hands. Smoke drifted from the barrel. His breath came in ragged gulps, adrenaline racing. This was the end he had sought. The four men who had unleashed unimaginable cruelty on him were gone, each having met a violent fate. Yet victory felt hollow. Buddy was still gone, the ranch still marred by ruins and pain. Footsteps thundered in the corridor outside, reinforcements, no doubt. Sirens, too. The timed explosions had likely drawn official attention by now, and even the wealth of these men could not keep law enforcement away forever. He needed to vanish. Pain jabbed at his wounded arm as he turned away from the dead men. Escaping proved a challenge. The estate's corridors reverberated with shouts and frantic activity. Sylvester found a servant's passage leading to the kitchen. There, amid a flurry of staff trying to escape, he mingled briefly, then slipped out a side door onto the grounds. The perimeter was still in confusion from the earlier explosions. He avoided the main gates, ducking through the hole he'd cut in the fence. Shots rang out behind him, but none found their mark. Only when he was safely back in his truck, engine roaring down the dirt road, did he allow himself to breathe more steadily. He had done it. The vow he made at Buddy's grave was fulfilled. For men had inflicted horror on his life, and now all four were gone. But that final sense of triumph evaded him. Guilt, relief, sorrow, and a haunting emptiness churned within, clashing in his chest. He drove until the estate vanished in the rearview mirror. The horizon lightened with the first hint of dawn, revealing farmland that stretched in gentle undulations. Though battered, he felt drawn to the open spaces, as if only nature's vastness could cradle his fractured spirit. Part of him yearned to return to the ranch, to see if any semblance of life could be salvaged there. Another part wondered if he should simply disappear, drifting to another corner of the world where no one knew his name or his story. One thing was certain, the men who had cast him into this nightmare were no longer a threat. He parked on a grassy overlook, stared at the rising sun, and reached into his jacket pocket for the worn photograph of Buddy. It was smudged, bent around the edges, stained with traces of ash from that dreadful night. He ran a thumb over the dog's image. The pang of loss was relentless. But now it was tempered by the knowledge that justice, in its rawest form, had been done. He could almost hear Buddy's bark echo across the hush of dawn. Was it acceptance? Forgiveness? He did not know. All he knew was that the vow had been kept. And with that vow completed, a new chapter, though uncertain, waited somewhere beyond the horizon. Time has a curious way of moving forward, even when one's soul feels caught in a violent past. In the aftermath of the final confrontation, Sylvester found himself drifting from one remote place to another, staying off the grid whenever possible. He changed vehicles, used cash for every transaction, and avoided areas with high foot traffic or security cameras. News of the estate massacre dominated headlines for weeks. People speculated about a vigilante's rampage. Some pinned it on rival criminal organizations. Authorities declared a massive investigation, though no conclusive leads emerged. The families of the four men tried to bury their scandal with money and influence. Official statements described tragic incidents that had claimed the heirs to prominent fortunes. They stopped short of connecting the dots publicly, perhaps because acknowledging the truth would drag their entire network into the light. The hush around the affair might have been orchestrated by the same political strings that once protected the men. In a dark irony, now the powerful families hushed it up to shield themselves from embarrassment. Sylvester, meanwhile, waged a private battle against the ghosts of what he had done. In spare motel rooms, he'd wake at odd hours, chest tight, remembering the final stare of each man he had killed. Then, inevitably, he'd recall Buddy's limp body, the farm set ablaze, and the savage laughter that had set him on this path. He tried not to ask himself if there was any other course he could have taken. Perhaps the law, if it had functioned differently, would have brought them to justice. But in the world he inhabited, the law had turned a blind eye to their crimes. Sometimes he flipped through a notebook filled with sketches of the ranch. Long before the tragedy, he had planned expansions, new pens for livestock, a fresh orchard, a second barn. The notes felt like relics of a vanished existence. Could he truly go back? Even if he rebuilt, the place would always hold the memory of that night's horror. Yet something in him refused to abandon the land altogether. He had paid for it with sweat and hope, and it was still his, in law if not in spirit. Eventually, he made the decision to return. A part of him felt the ranch was all he had left in terms of home. Maybe he could find a measure of redemption in restoring it, or at least put the ghosts to rest. And so, one cool morning under a pale sky, he navigated back to the county he had once called his sanctuary. The drive felt surreal, the roads lined with memories of a simpler time. He passed the diner where he used to chat with farmers, the feed store he frequented for supplies, all of it tinted by the knowledge of what had unfolded since. At first, the sight of the ranch was a punch to the gut. The main gate lay twisted, he'd never fully repaired it after the truck rammed through. The barns stood in blackened ruins, the scorched earth around them barren. Overgrowth had begun to reclaim parts of the yard, tangles of weeds rising through the charred wreckage. The farmhouse itself bore signs of neglect, broken windows boarded up, sagging porch. But it was still standing. It recognized him, or so it seemed. He parked his truck, got out, and stood in silence for a long time. The wind rustled the tall grass, now untrimmed and wild. A sense of calm pervaded the place, like the land itself had been waiting, patient and unwavering, despite human cruelty. He walked over to the oak tree under which he had buried Buddy. The marker stone was still there, albeit somewhat shifted by rain and time. Kneeling, he traced a hand over the soil, heart heavy. For days, he simply cleaned. He cleared debris from the yard, hauled away twisted metal, and carefully tore down what remained of the stable, salvaging any wood that could be repurposed. Neighbors came by. Some timid, some curious. A few offered assistance with hauling or disposal. They exchanged quiet looks, as though uncertain how to speak about the rancher's rumored involvement in the violence that had ripped through the region. He reciprocated their kindness with measured gratitude, never admitting nor denying anything about the stories swirling in the local grapevine. Little by little, the ranch began to show signs of life again. He patched the farmhouse's roof, replaced shattered windows, and refurbished the porch. A new gate, simpler than the old one, took shape with fresh lumber. He replaced sections of fencing, hammered nails until his arms felt like lead, each strike a small act of reclamation. Though alone, he found a certain solace in the labor. It was straightforward and honest, a stark contrast to the subterfuge and brutality that had consumed him. He even purchased a new pup from a local rescue shelter, a skittish mix of collie and shepherd, timid around strangers but affectionate once trust was earned. He didn't dare name it right away, unsure if he was ready to open his heart like that again. Yet the dog's presence offered a flicker of companionship that eased the echoing emptiness whenever he walked across the farm. Rumors persisted around town, whispers of a man returning from the edge, of the quiet vigilante who might have spilled the blood of evil men. Few confronted him directly. The sheriff, a different figure now since the old one had retired under pressure, came by once, politely checking that everything was all right. Sylvester answered in noncommittal phrases, and the sheriff, lacking evidence, left him in peace. The people of the county had gleaned that crossing certain lines only led to more destruction. Seasons shifted. He planted new seeds in the fields, watered them, tended them with the same care he once gave the ranch in the early days. The cycle of growth and harvest felt reaffirming, an emblem of resilience. No matter how much cruelty burned across the land, nature found a way to heal. He found himself adopting more animals, a few chickens, a pair of goats. Simple creatures that asked for nothing but feed, water, and a bit of kindness. Their presence offered a form of therapy he didn't consciously acknowledge but felt in his bones. He also built a small memorial for Buddy near the old oak tree, marking it with carved wood that read, "Here lies my best friend." It wasn't elaborate, but it was heartfelt. Sometimes he'd sit in the grass by that tree, the new pup curling at his feet, and stare at the farmland stretching to the horizon. In those moments, he allowed himself to remember both the good and the awful. The dog's unwavering loyalty, the nightmarish violence, and the lethal retribution he had exacted. All were part of the tapestry of his life now. One morning, a young reporter from a regional paper appeared at his gate, notebook in hand, eyes bright with curiosity. She had pieced together fragments of rumors, seeking a human interest story about a once famous actor turned rancher whose life had taken a tragic turn. Sylvester politely turned her away. His story, if told at all, would be his alone to share, not fodder for sensational journalism. She left disappointed, but without hostility. He wondered if she might still write something, perhaps a speculative piece. Let her. He had passed the point of caring about public perception. Gradually, the farm resumed a semblance of normalcy, though scars remained etched in every corner. Some nights, he'd wake from nightmares of gunfire and flames, heart thudding until he rose, splashed water on his face, and reminded himself that it was over. At least, the immediate threat was. Could the families of the men he killed ever come after him? Possibly. But that was a risk he chose to live with. He had no illusions of being entirely safe, only that he now possessed a peace of mind that their fear could not sway. By late summer, the fields were lush again. He harvested crops, donated some to neighbors, sold a portion at a small local market. People chatted with him about the weather, about pests in the fields. Occasionally, someone would give him a nod that seemed laced with understated respect. As if acknowledging the silent storm he had survived. The new dog, now named Lucky, trailed him with a wagging tail, forging a bond that reminded Sylvester of what he had lost and also what was yet to be cherished. The final piece of closure came as a surprise. A letter arrived in his mailbox, its envelope bearing no return address. Inside was a simple note, "We know what you did, and we will let sleeping dogs lie." Accompanying it was a photograph of an influential figure known to be tied to one of the dead men's families, along with a news clipping indicating that person's quiet resignation from a major political role. A cryptic reassurance, perhaps, that the families had decided to let vengeance rest, not wishing to unearth the skeletons that might implicate them further. He burned the note without ceremony, taking it as the best outcome he could hope for in a situation drenched with moral ambiguity. No more retaliation, no more hidden wars. He was free, or as free as a man can be after crossing the lines he had crossed. The ashes drifted into the wind, and he turned back to the ranch tasks that awaited him. In the cooling twilight, he would walk the perimeter of his property, Lucky bounding ahead. Sometimes the dog chased barn cats or barked at imaginary threats in the hedgerows. Sylvester breathed in the scent of cut hay, the swirl of dust dancing in the last rays of sun. Far from perfect, far from untroubled, but it was his life, reclaimed from the brink of despair. Each step was an affirmation, the land endured, and so did he. He never sought to rewrite the horrors that had happened. The memories were part of him now. But each day's labor, each small kindness shared with a neighbor, each sunrise that painted the fields in gold, these experiences reminded him that there was still beauty worth tending to, despite everything. He might never fully escape the realm of violence that had claimed him, but he could strive to balance it with acts of creation and care. In the end, that was the legacy he chose, to rebuild what had been broken, to offer compassion where once there was vengeance, and to stand as a quiet testament that even a battered soul could find a semblance of peace. Whenever he felt the sting of memory, he'd head to Buddy's resting spot beneath the oak, bow his head, and whisper, "We kept our promise." From the farmhouse porch at sunset, he could see the gentle arc of the horizon line, unbroken fields stretching to meet the sky. No camera crews swarmed, no paparazzi snapped pictures of his every move. Instead, cicadas thrummed in the bushes, and a soft breeze carried the fragrance of wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. This was his domain now. The wounds were deep, but so were the roots of his new beginning. He settled into his rocking chair, Lucky at his side, and watched the sky fade from pink to deep violet. Stars began to glimmer overhead, an infinite tapestry that reminded him of all the nights he had missed back in Hollywood, nights drowned by artificial lights and forced smiles. Here, under this vast sky, he felt both small and profoundly alive. Each breath was a gift he no longer took for granted. With a final, quiet sigh, Sylvester murmured into the darkness, "We're home." And the ranch, in its silent, steadfast way, seemed to answer, welcoming him to a life he had earned through blood and heartbreak, a life that, at long last, was truly his own. The summer sun rose earlier than ever that year, casting soft rays through the tall grass on the ranch's western fields. Sylvester woke to that light each morning with a renewed sense of purpose, a feeling both foreign and strangely comforting. Months had passed since the final confrontation that extinguished the threat lingering on his horizon, and now, his days took on a new rhythm, one neither defined by vengeance nor overshadowed by the ghosts of recent history. Instead, his focus had shifted to the quiet work of healing and rebuilding in ways he never anticipated. He found the mornings particularly serene. The hush before dawn was his time to walk the perimeter fences, checking posts and wire, ensuring that stray animals hadn't forced their way in overnight. Lucky, the young pup he'd adopted, bounded at his side with an unbridled enthusiasm that reminded him that life, for all its complexity, still held simple joys. The dog's wagging tail and eager yips beckoned him to put aside his darker memories, if only for a few minutes, and appreciate the dew-laden grass and the gentle warmth of the new sun. There were still reminders of the brutal past. A section of the old barn foundation remained visible near the oak tree. He had cleared the charred rubble but decided to leave a portion of the stone foundation exposed, a monument to what he'd lost and a testament to the new beginnings built on top of hardship. When visitors asked about it, he offered a polite but vague explanation, a fire, a tragedy, something he'd rather not dwell upon. Most sensed the pain beneath his quiet words and did not press further. Despite the lingering scars, the land itself had rebounded under his care. Where ashes once covered fields, rows of green shoots now swayed in the breeze. He cultivated a modest vegetable garden, planting tomatoes, peppers, beans, enough variety to fill the farmhouse pantry and share surplus with neighbors. Each afternoon, he'd spend a stretch of time in the garden, Lucky scampering around, chasing insects through rows of young plants. The repetitive tasks of watering and weeding soothed his mind in ways he hadn't experienced before the chaos. The discipline he once channeled into rigorous Hollywood workouts or intense fight training scenes was now repurposed into nurturing life, and that transformation felt deeply personal. His connections with the local community also began to shift. Whereas once they had treated him with a blend of curiosity and caution, some suspecting that the wave of vigilante-like violence might have ties to him, they gradually accepted his unspoken desire for a normal existence. He volunteered on weekends at a local animal shelter, quietly donating funds and offering to fix fences for the dogs' outdoor runs. The staff, touched by his unassuming generosity, only later recognized him as the ex-actor turned rancher. If they harbored deeper questions about the rumors, they never voiced them. A sense of steady camaraderie blossomed with a few of the townspeople. He discovered that the retired deputy, whose help and information had once been crucial, maintained a small orchard on the outskirts of town. Sometimes they'd meet there at sunset, picking apples or plums in a peaceful routine. Over the course of these simple chores, the deputy would ask how the ranch repairs were going, never once mentioning the men whose power had hung over them both. Sylvester appreciated that tacit respect for boundaries. Their conversations felt like a subtle affirmation that their pact of silence was necessary for a truly fresh start. Every now and then, the nightmares returned. He'd bolt upright in bed, cold sweat staining the sheets, heart pounding from visions of flaming barns and the echo of gunshots in cramped hallways. When this happened, Lucky would hop onto the bed, pressing a warm muzzle against Sylvester's arm. The dog's companionship had become an anchor. More than once, in the middle of such a night, Sylvester would wander outside, down the porch steps, and sit by Buddy's resting place under the oak tree. There, he'd breathe in the cool air, calming himself by running a hand across the ground that marked his beloved companion's grave. In those moments, he'd close his eyes and summon the memory of Buddy's gentle presence, letting it guide him back from the brink of his darkest recollections. The question of forgiveness or redemption haunted him in quieter hours. Though he had acted in the name of justice, his version of it, he understood that blood spilled does not simply wash away. He carried those memories like a chain forged of grief and necessity. Instead of letting that weight consume him, he decided to direct his energy toward something constructive. So he began sponsoring local youth programs, offering them space on his ranch for nature retreats and weekend gatherings. It warmed him to see kids running through the fields, unburdened by the shadows of adult conflicts. They rode horses he rescued and rehabilitated. They learned to fish in the creek that once provided him solace in his earliest days here. Their laughter drifted across the ranch, a gentle balm on old wounds. Occasionally, older acquaintances from his Hollywood days would track him down, curious about his abrupt departure and rumored life in the middle of nowhere. A few even visited, stepping out of flashy cars onto dusty gravel, glancing around at the rustic house and half-renovated barn with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He welcomed them politely, served coffee or sweet tea on the porch, and listened to their updates on film projects, award shows, or entertainment gossip. But as they rambled on about red carpets and paparazzi, he realized how distant that world now felt. It wasn't bitterness that he felt, more a quiet sense of relief that his life had grown simpler and, in many ways, more authentic. Word of his tranquil homestead sometimes spread to fans who would show up unannounced, hoping to meet the legendary actor. While he was unfailingly courteous, signing an autograph or sharing a quick photo, he made it plain that he valued his privacy. Most understood. Respect for personal space was a precious commodity here, and the townsfolk, perhaps protective of their local celebrity-turned-neighbor, discouraged tourists from invading his farm. He was grateful for their silent guardianship. The sheriff's office changed leadership again, and the new deputy occasionally stopped by to ensure everything was all right, an informal courtesy check. The conversations were cordial. Nothing in their tone hinted at suspicion, and Sylvester guessed that the painful episodes of violence had been relegated to a murky corner of local lore. The region had moved on, focusing on its everyday trials, droughts, crop failures, road maintenance. Life was simpler that way, and Sylvester was content to let it remain so. Gradually, the ranch reclaimed its identity as a place of peace rather than destruction. Sylvester resurrected the horse stable from the rubble, installing a sturdy roof and fresh hay. He rescued a few more animals from auctions, 2 neglected horses with dull coats and sorrowful eyes, bringing them back to health one feeding at a time. Brushing them in the early morning light, he felt the same serenity that once defined his earliest days on the farm. The cyclical nature of tending animals and land grounded him, reminding him that existence carried on despite the scars. People in town who once regarded him with a wary nod now included him in local events. He was invited to a harvest festival, where he discreetly served as a judge for the best homemade pie, tasting slice after slice of sweet, crumbly goodness. Laughter filled the air, children ran in circles, and for a fleeting moment, Sylvester felt fully immersed in a community that might finally see him as just another rancher, a man with a past, yes, but also a future worth embracing. Only in quiet evenings, when Lucky trotted back into the house after roaming the fields, did Sylvester pause to recall the precise contours of all that had happened. There had been so much pain, untold heartbreak, unleashed violence, and unstoppable fury. Yet here he was, months later, standing in a place that bore witness to both the worst night of his life and the determined rebirth that followed. If there was a lesson in all of it, it might be that devastation and hope can coexist, bound by the will to keep living. Sometimes he would wander to the edge of the creek at twilight. The water caught the dying light, turning lavender in the dusk. He'd remember how he used to fish there, Buddy waiting by his side, how the slow pace of the ranch once filled him with gratitude. That gratitude was still possible, he felt it stirring in him anew, not erasing the tragedy but living alongside it. A survivor's gratitude, tinged with sorrow, yet still real. In these moments, he found himself whispering thanks, to fate or the universe, he wasn't sure, for allowing him another chance to rebuild. He might never fully shed the weight of his actions, but he refused to let that weight define him. Instead, he embraced the small good things, an abundant crop, a healthy foal born to one of his rescued mares, a casual supper with neighbors who treated him like family. He didn't need grand Hollywood acclaim or the roar of applause. The gentle hum of cicadas, the warmth of a well-tended home, and the companionship of a dog who looked at him with unwavering trust, these were enough. Thus, life began its slow, determined evolution for Sylvester Stallone. The ranch, once a site of unspeakable violence, turned again into a haven, shaped by his own hands and quiet resolve. Though the world beyond might still whisper rumors, in this secluded pocket of countryside he found the simple truth of healing. It isn't about forgetting but about moving forward, step by mindful step, forging a fresh path from the ashes of the old. And in that new chapter of his life, the man who had walked away from fame and weathered unimaginable cruelty discovered that sometimes, the deepest peace lies on the far side of the hardest battles, a peace guarded by the lessons of the past, and nurtured by the hope that tomorrow's sunrise carries a gentler promise.